All right, so election's just a week away,
Oh, yeah.
and we're doing a deep dive into, well, I guess you could say a figure who's at the center of it all, Kamala Harris. Now, I think a lot of people think they know her. They see the headlines, they hear the sound bites, but who is she really? Beyond all that, beyond the surface. And what kind of a leader could she be, really? What kind of a leader?
I think it's really interesting because we're not looking at just another politician here, right? We're talking about someone who's really shattered glass ceilings. I mean, the first female, first Black, and first South Asian vice president, her journey, it's a story of breaking barriers. And I think that's just the start of what makes her so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's way more than just like a biography, isn't it? It's about understanding what these firsts could mean for American leadership moving forward. So let's trace her path, to this moment.
Well, she didn't just magically appear out of nowhere. This is someone who built a career brick by brick, from San Francisco district attorney to California attorney general, then U.S. senator, and now, of course, the vice president. Each step, each job probably, shaped her, in ways that are worth unpacking.
Okay, so she wasn't handed this role. It was a climb. What really stands out to you about how those jobs, those different positions might have kind of shaped her approach to leadership, how she views leadership?
Her time as a prosecutor, right, both in San Francisco, and then at the state level in California. That probably really instilled in her a deep respect for the law, a real focus on order and enforcement. It makes sense, logically, that this would influence her views on things like criminal justice reform, for example, or even border security.
Right, that makes sense. But then she went to the Senate, which is a whole other, a whole other animal, a whole other beast. How do you think that experience kind of broadened her perspective?
Well, the Senate forced her to grapple with, so many issues, a wider range of issues than she ever would have as a prosecutor. Suddenly, she's got to develop positions on everything from healthcare to climate change to foreign policy. It's the whole gamut. So it forced her to become, kind of like a policy generalist in a way.
So we're seeing kind of a blend here, right?
Yeah.
This background in law enforcement, but also, like you said, this broader lens, this policy lens that she gained in the Senate. And that kind of leads us to something that I think has sparked a lot of debate, which is how her policy stances have evolved over time, right?
Exactly. There are some pretty notable shifts, especially in areas like healthcare, criminal justice, even immigration. And these changes, of course, have raised questions about whether they represent genuine changes in her thinking and what she believes, or if they're more strategic adjustments she's making, reacting to the political landscape, how it is.
Let's dive into those. I think they're really key to understanding her as a potential president. Let's start with healthcare. During her presidential run, I remember she was a really vocal supporter of Medicare for all. But then she seemed to kind of moderate her stance a bit, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that shift is really fascinating because it gets at this fundamental tension within the Democratic Party. That push for a single-payer system versus kind of this more incremental approach to healthcare reform. So did she really, just change her mind? Or was it more about, the realities of how you actually get legislation passed? Tough to know for sure.
Yeah, you can never really know what's going on in someone's head, right? But we can look at their actions, their record. And it's not just healthcare either. Her views on criminal justice seem to have shifted too, right? Early on, she had this, reputation pretty much as a tough-on-crime prosecutor. But later in the Senate, she was super vocal, advocating for things like sentencing reform and police accountability.
Right, that's a big one. And it really raises those questions about the nature of political evolution, I think. Do these shifts represent genuine, changes in thinking, or are they more reactions to the political winds, whatever's popular at the time,
It's a tough question for voters to grapple with, right?
Yeah.
As they try to evaluate her and decide what they think. And then, of course, there's immigration, another one of those hot-button issues where it seems like her stance is kind of, evolved.
Oh, for sure. Early in her career, enforcing immigration laws was part of her job as a prosecutor. It's what she did. But then as a senator and as vice president, she's been advocating for a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And she's also been critical of some of those, harder line immigration policies we've seen in recent years.
So it seems like there's a pattern here, right? This willingness to adapt, to shift positions over time. Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Both. What do you make of it?
Well, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? On one hand, it suggests she's flexible, a willingness to learn and grow. But then on the other hand, it can make people wonder about her consistency. Are these deeply held beliefs, or is it more about, political expediency, doing whatever it takes to get ahead?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure. And
Yeah.
ultimately, each voter has to decide how they feel about it. But, let's not shy away from the tough stuff here. No deep dive would be complete without, digging into the critiques.
Oh, absolutely. We need to understand the full picture, and that includes the criticisms. Even if they're uncomfortable, it's part of being informed.
One of the most common ones we see, I think, ties directly back to what we were just discussing, those policy shifts. Critics say, her record is just too inconsistent, that it lacks a clear set of principles.
Right, and that's a critique that's often thrown at politicians who've been in the game for a while. They've been around the block a few times. Views evolve, and sometimes that evolution can appear to, lack a connecting thread. You know what I mean? Like, it's not clear what ties it all together. It's really up to the candidate to tell a story that explains it all, that shows that there's this core set of values underpinning everything they do.
So how well do you think she's done that? Has she successfully explained those shifts in a way that makes sense to people?
I think it's a mixed bag, honestly. I mean, she's tried to frame her policy evolution as this process of learning and growth, but it remains to be seen, I think, whether that resonates with voters, whether it's enough to build trust.
Yeah, that's fair. Another critique we've seen has to do with kind of her legislative record, right? Some people argue that, despite her time in the Senate, she doesn't have like a long list of legislative wins to point to.
Right, and that's a common criticism that gets leveled at senators with presidential ambitions. It's like they're often more focused on building that national profile, getting their name out there than they are on the, the day-to-day grind of actually passing laws. The question is, how much weight should voters give to that? Should we judge her solely on her legislative record?
It's a good question. And it's not always easy to measure, like, someone's effectiveness by just the number of bills they've passed, right? I mean, the Senate's a tough place to get things done, especially these days with all the partisan gridlock.
Oh, absolutely. Context matters a lot. But let's shift gears a bit here. Let's talk about something that's always front and center in an election year, and that's electability. How is Kamala Harris perceived by the public? What's the general feeling? How do people feel about her?
Yeah, public perception, it's such a slippery thing. It's constantly in flux, and there's so many factors at play. Approval ratings, how she's portrayed in the media, the level of support within her own party, it's all connected.
Let's try to unpack some of those, one by one. Starting with approval ratings, where does she stand? What do the numbers say?
Well, her approval ratings have consistently been lower than President Biden's.
Yeah.
Which, could be a challenge. I mean, it suggests that she might not have that same level of broad public support that he enjoys.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. But approval ratings aren't the whole story, of course. How has she been covered by the press? What's the media narrative around her? How are they portraying her?
The media portrayals have been kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, she's been praised for her historic achievements, her sharp intellect, all that. But there's also been criticism, some of it pretty harsh. Some people say she lacks charisma, or that she's maybe a little too cautious, a bit too scripted in her public statements, not really letting loose.
So it's like she's walking a tightrope, trying to navigate this really tricky media landscape and, trying to project this image that will resonate with voters. But what about party support? Does she have the full backing of the Democrats? Is everyone on board?
Generally, yeah. The support within the party is pretty strong. But I mean, there are always those underlying tensions, especially between the progressive wing and the more moderate wing of the party. It's like trying to keep everyone happy is a constant balancing act for any leader.
And those internal divisions, of course, they can be exploited by opponents. They'll try to paint the Democrats as fractured and out of touch with the American people. It's a classic political tactic, divide and conquer.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, right? Her career path, those policy shifts, the critiques she's facing, and the whole question of her electability. But let's shift gears now and look ahead. What might a Harris presidency actually look like? I mean, if she wins, what can we expect?
That's the big question, isn't it? What kind of leader would she be? What would her priorities be? And what impact would her presidency have on the country? On the world, even?
Let's start with the basics. What do we think her policy focuses would be? Where would she put her energy? What issues would she prioritize?
Well, if we look at her past statements and actions, I think we can get some insights into her potential priorities. Criminal justice reform is an area where she's been particularly vocal, for example.
Yeah, that definitely aligns with her background, right? Both as a prosecutor and as a senator. So what kind of specific changes do you think she'd push for if she were president? I mean,
Well, I think we could see her pushing for policies aimed at, things like reducing mass incarceration, addressing the racial disparities that we see in the justice system, promoting police accountability. These are all things she's spoken about extensively.
So potentially big changes to the criminal justice system.
Huh.
What other areas might she prioritize? What are some of the other big ticket items on her agenda?
Climate change is another issue that she's really passionate about. It wouldn't be surprising to see her pursuing some pretty ambitious policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, investing in clean energy, and addressing the very real impacts of climate change that we're already seeing all around us.
That would be a pretty big shift in direction from what we've seen in recent years, wouldn't it? And given her own background, it seems likely that issues like economic inequality and racial justice would be, pretty high on her agenda as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she's spoken very powerfully about the need to address systemic racism and create a more just and equitable society. I think we could expect her to focus on policies aimed at, things like closing the racial wealth gap, expanding access to affordable healthcare and education, and promoting economic opportunity for marginalized communities.
So potentially a presidency focused on issues like criminal justice reform, climate change, economic inequality, and racial justice. Those are some big interconnected challenges, aren't they?
They are. And addressing one often requires tackling the others as well. For example, criminal justice reform is inherently linked to issues of racial justice and economic inequality. And climate change, of course, it disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities.
It's all connected. It's not just about individual policies. It's about a broader vision for a more just and equitable society. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for right now.
There's definitely a sense of that, a real hunger for change. People want leadership that can address these systemic issues head on and not just tinker around the edges.
Okay, so we've talked about these big picture goals, but let's bring it down to earth a bit, make it real for folks. How might Harris presidency impact businesses, the economy, foreign policy? These are things that people worry about, things that affect their everyday lives.
Absolutely. It's a crucial question and one that deserves careful consideration because her policies, if she's elected, they're going to have ripple effects across all those areas for sure.
So let's break it down. Let's start with business. What might her policies mean for the business community? What should they be preparing for?
I think her stance on things like corporate taxes and regulations would be of particular interest to businesses, keep them up at night. She's supported increasing taxes on corporations to fund social programs, and she's also been critical of what she sees as, excessive deregulation, too much freedom for businesses. So, under a Harris administration, businesses could potentially face higher tax burdens and stricter regulations.
I bet that's something they'll be watching very closely. But what about the economy as a whole? What kind of impact might her policies have on things like jobs, growth, and inflation?
Well, I think her economic policies would likely focus on promoting economic growth while also addressing inequality. Things like raising the minimum wage, expanding access to affordable childcare, investing in infrastructure. Those kinds of policies, they could definitely stimulate the economy, but they could also lead to higher government spending and potentially higher taxes down the line. As always, it's a balancing act.
It always is. Right.
Yeah.
Trying to stimulate growth while also making sure that the benefits of that growth are widely shared.
Yeah.
Making sure that everyone benefits, not just those at the top. Now, let's turn to foreign policy. This is an area where, she's faced some criticism, I think fairly for her, what some perceive as her lack of experience. So, what can we expect from her on the global stage? What kind of foreign policy approach would she take?
Well, it's true. She might not have the same, level of foreign policy experience as some other presidents, but she has demonstrated this real commitment to multilateralism and diplomacy. I think it's likely that she would prioritize things like strengthening alliances, working with international organizations, to address those big global challenges like climate change and pandemics, and, of course, promoting human rights around the world.
So we might see a shift away from that America First approach that we saw from the previous administration, more of a focus on cooperation and diplomacy.
That's certainly a possibility. I mean, she's talked about the need for the U.S. to kind of reassert its global leadership role, but she's also emphasized the importance of, working collaboratively with other nations. It's about finding that balance, right, between leading and cooperating.
It sounds like, potentially a blend of idealism and pragmatism on the foreign policy front, trying to uphold American values while also, like you said, navigating the the complexities of the world as it is.
Exactly. She'd have to balance her commitment to democracy and human rights with, this realistic understanding of how international relations actually work. It's a tough job no matter who's in it.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? From her early career and those evolving policy positions to, this potential presidency, this what-if scenario of a Harris presidency and how it might impact businesses, the economy, foreign policy. It's been a lot to process, but I feel like I'm starting to get a clearer picture of who she is, what she stands for.
Me too. I think that's really the point of these deep dives, isn't it? To go beyond the surface and really understand the nuances.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked about what she might prioritize if she wins, but how does she actually plan to win? What's her 2024 strategy looking like? How is she going to convince voters that she's the right person for the job?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think any winning strategy has to address those challenges we discussed earlier. Things like her approval ratings, those critiques about her shifting policy positions over time. Those are things her opponents are going to, they're going to hammer on those points for sure.
So how do you see her campaign tackling those hurdles? What's their plan of attack?
Well, one key element seems to be focusing on mobilizing the Democratic base, getting those voters energized and out to vote. She's been actively courting Black voters, women, and young people, groups that are, historically crucial to Democratic victories. Getting them fired up into the polls is going to be essential.
Makes sense. Those are groups that have, historically been pretty reliable Democratic voters. But she can't win with just the base, can she? She's going to need to persuade some undecided voters as well, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's where things get a lot trickier, I think. Her campaign's going to have to find a way to reach those voters who are on the fence. Or maybe even, leaning toward the other side. It's about convincing them that she understands their concerns and that she has a plan to address them, that she's listening.
So how do you win over those undecided voters, especially in this crazy, polarized political climate we're in? Seems like everyone's already made up their mind. They're dug in.
Well, it's a tough task, for sure, but it's not impossible. One approach is to focus on issues that have broad appeal across party lines, like the economy or healthcare. Find those areas of common ground where people can agree. Another approach is to draw a clear contrast with the opponent, highlighting their weaknesses and emphasizing your own strengths. It's about making a strong case for why you're the better choice, the one who can actually deliver.
And of course, running a strong ground game is essential, right? Getting your supporters registered to vote, making sure they actually show up on election day. That's where elections are often won and lost.
Oh, absolutely. No campaign can succeed without a well-organized and effective ground game. It's about getting your message out to voters, knocking on doors, making phone calls, and just making sure people have the information they need to cast their ballots. It's the nuts and bolts of winning an election.
So we're talking about a multi-pronged strategy here, right? Mobilizing the base, persuading undecided voters, and running a strong ground game. That's a lot to juggle, especially with only a week left until Election Day.
It is. It requires a really skilled and disciplined campaign operation. I guess we'll have to wait and see how effectively her campaign executes on these different fronts. The clock is definitely ticking.
Well, buckle up, folks, because this election is shaping up to be a real nail-biter. Okay, so let's imagine for a moment that she pulls it off. What kind of impact might a Harris presidency have on the country? What would it mean for America?
That's a huge question. And the potential ramifications are, well, they're significant. Her presidency would represent a historic shift in American politics, breaking down barriers and potentially paving the way for a more diverse and inclusive leadership.
That in itself would be a huge impact, wouldn't it? Seeing someone like her in the Oval Office. But politics isn't just about symbolism, right? It's about concrete policies and how those policies affect people's everyday lives. So how might her policies specifically impact different sectors of society? What would it actually mean for people?
That's where things get really interesting, I think. We've already touched on her potential priorities, like criminal justice reform, climate change, economic inequality. But, let's delve a little deeper into how those priorities might actually translate into real policies and what those policies might mean for different groups of people. It's about connecting the dots between ideas and impact.
Okay, let's start with criminal justice reform. This is an area where, she's been a leading voice, as we've discussed. So what specific policy changes might she pursue, and how might those changes impact communities that have been disproportionately affected by mass incarceration?
Well, I think she is likely to push for policies aimed at things like, ending mandatory minimum sentences, reducing the use of cash bail, which can be really problematic, and investing in alternatives to incarceration, things like drug treatment and mental health services. These are all things she's talked about before. And these policies, I think, could have a really profound impact on communities of color, which, as we know, have been, disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system for decades, really.
Those would be some pretty major shifts in the criminal justice system, for sure. It's an area that I think a lot of people feel is, it's ripe for reform. And it seems like she's really determined to tackle it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's move on to climate change. This is another issue that she's clearly passionate about. So what kind of climate policies might we see under a Harris administration? And how might those policies impact, businesses, consumers, and the environment itself?
I think we could see her taking a really comprehensive approach to climate change, investing in renewable energy, promoting energy efficiency, enacting stricter regulations on polluters. These kinds of policies, they could lead to job creation in the clean energy sector, lower energy costs for consumers, and of course, a cleaner, healthier environment for everyone.
Those are some pretty significant potential benefits. But of course, any major policy shift is going to have both winners and losers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who might be impacted negatively by her climate policies? I mean, there are always trade-offs, right, when you're talking about big changes.
Right. There are always trade-offs. And in this case, the fossil fuel industry is likely to face some challenges under a Harris administration because she's pledged to transition away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. So, this could lead to job losses in the fossil fuel industry and maybe even higher costs for businesses that rely heavily on fossil fuels. It's something to consider, for sure.
That's a valid concern. And, it's one that her administration would have to address, right? It's important to ensure a just transition to a clean energy economy, one that supports workers and communities that are impacted by that shift away from fossil fuels. It can't just be about sweeping change without thinking about the consequences for people's livelihoods.
Okay, let's talk about economic inequality. This is a complex issue, and there are no easy solutions, right? So, what kind of policies might she pursue to address this issue? And how might those policies impact different income groups? Who would benefit, and who might face challenges?
I think we could see her focusing on policies aimed at, things like boosting wages, expanding access to affordable health care and education, and providing tax relief for working families. Those kinds of policies, they could help to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor, but they could also lead to higher taxes for wealthier Americans and businesses, potentially. It's, again, it's about finding that balance.
It always is in politics, isn't it? Trying to create a more equitable economy while also promoting economic growth. It's a challenge that every president faces. Now, let's turn to an issue that I know is particularly relevant to our deep dive audience, business. How might a Harris presidency impact the business community? What kind of changes might they see? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that, a lot of business leaders are surely pondering right now. I think her policies are likely to have kind of a mixed impact on businesses. Some businesses are going to benefit from her focus on clean energy and infrastructure investment, while others might face challenges from her stance on issues like taxes and regulations. It really depends on the sector, what industry you're in.
So let's break that down a bit. What specific policies might be beneficial to businesses and why? Where are the potential opportunities here?
Well, I think her focus on investing in infrastructure could create a lot of new opportunities for businesses, especially in sectors like construction, manufacturing, and transportation. Her support for clean energy could also benefit businesses that are, developing or deploying clean energy technologies. There's a lot of potential there for growth and innovation, for sure.
So we're potentially looking at a boost for certain sectors of the economy. But as you mentioned, some businesses may face some challenges as well. So what policies might those be and why? Where might there be headwinds?
Well, her support for raising the minimum wage could increase labor costs for businesses that, that rely on low-wage workers. And her stance on corporate taxes could lead to higher tax burdens for some businesses. These are all things that they'll have to factor in and adapt to if she's elected.
So it's kind of a mixed bag for the business community, as it often is with any new administration, right?
No.
Businesses will need to be nimble and strategic in how they adapt to that changing policy landscape. It's about being proactive, anticipating what's coming, and making adjustments accordingly.
Okay, we've talked about, potential impacts on criminal justice, climate change, economic inequality, and business. Let's wrap things up for today by discussing one final area, foreign policy, How might a Harris presidency reshape America's role in the world? What kind of shifts might we see? Would she take a different approach than we've seen recently?
That's a question with global implications, for sure. And I think her foreign policy is likely to be shaped by her commitment to, multilateralism, diplomacy, and human rights. We've already talked about her potential emphasis on cooperation and alliance building, right? So how would that play out in the real world?
Right. What might that look like in practice? What specific actions might she take on the world stage? What would be her priorities? I think we could see her prioritizing, rebuilding relationships with allies that were, well, let's be honest, that were strained under the previous administration. She's also likely to re-engage with international organizations like the United Nations and work collaboratively to address those big global challenges like climate change and pandemics that no one country can solve on its own. It's about restoring America's credibility and leadership on the world stage.
So a more cooperative and collaborative approach to foreign policy, that would be a pretty big change from the recent past, wouldn't it? A significant shift in tone and approach.
It would be. But, it remains to be seen how she would balance that desire for cooperation with the need to protect American interests, right? Because foreign policy is always a delicate balancing act, no matter who's in charge.
Well, we've covered an incredible amount of ground today, exploring Kamala Harris's career, her evolving policies, this potential presidency of hers, and the potential ramifications of her leadership. It's been a lot to take in, but I feel like we've gained some real insights here.
It's been a true deep dive, for sure. And I think it really underscores the complexity of the choices facing voters in this election. There's a lot to think about.
No doubt about it. There's a lot to consider, and it's up to each of us to, to weigh the different factors and make an informed decision. It's not just about picking a name on a ballot. It's about choosing a direction for the country.
And as we always say,
you know it.
Go vote.
Yes. Go vote. Your voice matters, and your vote is your voice. We'll be back next time for another deep dive. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Yeah, and it's not like, we're just picking a president, right? It's about, choosing what direction the whole country is going to go in for the next 4 years. I mean, the stakes are pretty high, right?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Okay, so we talked about what she might do if she wins. But how's she actually going to get there? How's she going to win? What's her strategy looking like for 2024? How's she going to convince those voters out there that she's the right person for the job?
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? And any strategy, any winning strategy has to deal with those challenges we talked about before, right? Like her approval ratings and all those critiques about how her policies have shifted over time. Her opponents, they're going to be all over those points, trying to use them against her.
So how do you think her campaign's going to tackle those hurdles? What's their plan? How are they going to deal with that stuff?
Well, one thing they seem to be focusing on is getting the Democratic base really fired up and out to vote. She's been making a real effort to connect with Black voters, women, young people, those groups.
Yeah.
Those are the voters who were crucial for Democrats, historically speaking. Got to get them energized and out to the polls.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are groups that have, reliably voted for Democrats in the past. But, she can't win with just the base, right? She's got to get some of those undecided voters on board, too.
Exactly, you're right. And that's where things get a lot trickier, I think. Her campaign has got to figure out a way to connect with those voters who are still on the fence, haven't decided yet, or maybe even, leaning towards the other side. She's got to convince them, that she gets it, that she understands what they're worried about, and that she actually has a plan to address those concerns to make things better for them.
So how do you do that? How do you win over those undecided voters?
Especially in this political climate where everything feels so, divided, so polarized. It feels like everyone's already picked a side and they're just dug in. It's tough, no question. But it's not impossible. I think one approach is to really focus on those issues that, that have broad appeal, that resonate with people across party lines. Issues like the economy or healthcare, stuff that affects everyone's lives, Find that common ground. Another thing you can do is really try to draw a clear contrast with your opponent. Highlight their weaknesses, the things they're not so good at, and then emphasize your own strengths, what you bring to the table. It's about making a strong case, a convincing argument for why you're the better choice, the one who can actually get things done.
And then, of course, there's the whole ground game, right?
Yeah.
All that stuff about getting your supporters registered to vote, making sure they actually show up at the polls on Election Day. That's where so many elections are won and lost, you know?
Oh, absolutely. You can have the best message in the world, but if you don't have a good ground game, you're not going to win. You got to have people out there knocking on doors, making phone calls, getting voters to the polls. It's the nuts and bolts, the blocking and tackling of winning an election.
So we're talking about a multi-pronged strategy here, right? You got to get the base excited, you got to persuade those undecided voters, and you got to have a solid ground game.
Yeah.
That's a lot to juggle, especially when you've only got like a week left.
It is. It takes a lot of skill and discipline, a really well-oiled machine. I guess we'll see how effectively they can execute on all those fronts, Time's running out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, buckle up, everyone, because this election is shaping up to be a real nail-biter. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's do a little thought experiment here. Let's say she wins. What kind of impact do you think a Harris presidency would have on the country?
Well, it's a huge question, right? I mean, the potential impact it's significant, no doubt about it. Just the fact of her presidency, a woman of color in the Oval Office, that would be a historic shift in American politics, breaking down barriers, paving the way for a more diverse and inclusive leadership.
That in itself would be huge, wouldn't it? I mean, just seeing someone like her in that position. But, politics is more than just symbols and representation, right? It's about policies. It's about how those policies play out in people's lives. So how do you think her policies would actually impact different parts of society?
Yeah.
What would it mean for everyday people?
That's where things get really interesting, I think. We've already touched on some of those potential priorities of hers, criminal justice reform, climate change, economic inequality, those big issues. But let's dig a little deeper. Let's see how those priorities might translate into actual policies, into concrete actions, and then, what those policies might mean for different groups of people. It's about connecting those dots, between ideas and impact.
Okay, let's start with criminal justice reform. This is an area where, as we said, she's really been a leading voice. So what kind of specific policy changes do you think she'd actually go for? And how might those changes affect the communities that have been hit the hardest by mass incarceration?
Well, she's talked about, ending those mandatory minimum sentences and reducing the use of cash bail, which we know can be really, really problematic. And she's also talked about, investing more in those alternatives to incarceration, like drug treatment programs and mental health services. These are all things she's talked about before. And I think these policies could have a huge impact, a really profound impact on communities of color, especially because they're the ones who've been disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system for decades, really.
Yeah, those would be major changes to how our criminal justice system works, for sure. I think a lot of people feel like that system is really in need of some serious reform. And it sounds like she's ready to take that on to really tackle it head on. All right, let's move on to climate change, another issue she's clearly passionate about. So what kind of climate policies might we see from a President Harris, and how might those policies affect businesses, consumers, the environment itself?
Well, I think she'd probably go for a really comprehensive approach to climate change, tackling it from all angles. Things like investing in renewable energy, promoting energy efficiency, enacting stricter regulations on polluters, those kinds of things. And these policies, they could have some really positive effects. Like, they could create jobs in the clean energy sector. They could lower energy costs for people, for consumers. And of course, they lead to a cleaner, healthier environment for everyone.
I mean, those are some pretty big potential benefits for sure. But, like we said before, every big policy change is going to have winners and losers.
Yeah.
So who do you think might be negatively affected by some of these climate policies? There are always trade-offs when you're talking about these big shifts.
Yeah, you're right. There are always trade-offs. And in this case, the fossil fuel industry, they're probably going to face some headwinds, some challenges under a Harris administration because, she said she wants to move away from fossil fuels to transition to a clean energy economy. And that could mean job losses for people in the fossil fuel industry.
Sure.
And it could mean higher costs for businesses that rely on fossil fuels. So it's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, that's a real concern. And it's something her administration would have to deal with, to address. It's important to make sure the transition to a clean energy economy is a just transition, one that doesn't leave people behind, that supports workers and communities who are affected by those changes. You can't just, make sweeping changes without thinking about the consequences, about how it's going to affect people's lives. Okay, let's talk about economic inequality for a minute. It's a complex issue, no doubt about it. So what kind of policies might she try to use to address this problem? And how might those policies affect different income groups? Who'd benefit and who might see things get a little tougher?
Well, I think she'd probably focus on things like, boosting wages, making sure people are earning a decent living,
Yeah.
and expanding access to affordable health care and education, and maybe providing some tax relief for working families to ease the burden a bit. Those policies could help to close the gap between the rich and the poor, but they could also lead to higher taxes for wealthier Americans and for businesses. So, it's that balancing act again, finding that sweet spot.
It always is in politics, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make things more equitable while also making sure the economy keeps growing. It's a tough needle to thread, a challenge that every president faces. Now let's talk about something I know our Deep Dive listeners care about, business. How might a Harris presidency affect the business community? What kinds of changes might they see? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure a lot of business leaders are, they're watching this election very closely, trying to figure out what it all means for them. I think, or her policies are going to have a mixed impact on businesses, like we've been saying. Some businesses are going to benefit. Some are going to face some challenges. It really depends on what sector you're in.
So let's break it down. What specific policies might be good for business? What are the opportunities here?
Well, like we talked about, her focus on investing in infrastructure, that could be really good for businesses in construction, manufacturing, transportation, those areas. And her support for clean energy, that could create a lot of opportunities for businesses that are developing or deploying those clean energy technologies. There's a lot of potential there for growth and innovation, for sure.
So we might see a boost for certain parts of the economy, certain sectors. But you also said that some businesses might face some headwinds. So what are those policies that might create challenges for businesses? What should they be looking out for?
Well, she supports raising the minimum wage, right? And that could increase labor costs for businesses that rely on a lot of low-wage workers. And her stance on corporate taxes, that could also lead to higher taxes for some businesses. So those are things that businesses will need to factor in, to adapt to if she's elected.
So it's kind of a mixed bag for the business community, as it often is with a new administration, right? Businesses will need to be flexible, to adjust to those changes. It's about being smart, being strategic. Right, so we've talked about criminal justice, climate change, economic inequality, and the business world. Let's wrap things up for today by talking about one last area, foreign policy. How might a Harris presidency change America's role in the world? Would things look different?
It's a question with, global implications, no doubt about it. And I think her foreign policy would probably be shaped by a few key things.
Yeah.
Her belief in multilateralism, working with other countries, her focus on diplomacy, on talking things out, on finding peaceful solutions, and her commitment to human rights, standing up for those values around the world. We've already talked about how she might prioritize cooperation and building alliances, right? So how would that actually work in practice?
Yeah. What would that look like in the real world? What kinds of specific actions might she take on the world stage?
Yeah.
What would be her priorities?
Well, I think we could see her really trying to rebuild those relationships with allies that got kind of strained under the previous administration, mending fences, so to speak. And she'd probably re-engage with those international organizations like the United Nations that the U.S. kind of stepped back from in recent years. And I think she'd really push for international cooperation to address those big global problems that no one country can solve on its own, like climate change or pandemics. It's about restoring America's standing in the world, getting back to that idea of America as a leader, but a leader who works with others, not just dictates.
So more cooperation, more collaboration, that would be a pretty big change from what we've seen recently, wouldn't it?
It would be, but the big question is how she would balance that desire for cooperation with the need to protect American interests, because foreign policy, it's always a balancing act no matter who's in charge.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We've really dug into Kamala Harris's career, how her policies have changed over time, what a potential presidency under her leadership might look like, and what that might mean for the world. It's been a lot to take in, but I feel like we've gotten a much clearer picture of who she is, what she stands for.
Yeah, me too. I think it's been a really good deep dive. And I think it really highlights how complex this election is. There's a lot for voters to think about, a lot to consider.
No doubt about it. And at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to weigh all those factors and decide what we think. It's not just about picking a name. It's about choosing a direction for the country.
And as we always say,
you know it.
Go vote.
Yes, go vote. Your voice matters, and your vote is how you make your voice heard. We'll be back next time for another deep dive. Until then, Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Yeah, no doubt. This one feels pretty important.
It does. It does. All right, so before we wrap things up here, I want to touch on one more thing. It's something that kept coming up in like all those articles and interviews we look at. Kamala Harris's leadership style. It's almost like she's trying to project a certain, image, a certain way of leading.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you think about it, political leadership, it's not just about like policies and stuff, right? It's also about persona, how you communicate, how you connect with people on, like a human level.
Exactly. So what kind of leadership style do you think she's going for? What's the vibe,
Well, from what I've seen, I think she's trying to project this blend of like competence and compassion, She wants people to see her as someone who's like smart, capable, gets things done, but also someone who's, empathetic, relatable, someone who understands what regular people are going through.
Okay, so it's not that like tough guy approach we've seen from some leaders. It's more like smart and caring.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, she definitely emphasizes her experience as a prosecutor, her ability to be tough when she needs to be. But she also talks a lot about her commitment to social justice, her understanding of the struggles of working families and marginalized communities. It's about, striking that balance.
Yeah, and that's a tough balance to strike, isn't it? Projecting strength, but also warmth, So do you think she's doing it? Do you think she's hitting the right notes?
It's hard to say, honestly. I think how people see her leadership style, it's still kind of like evolving. And in the end, it's up to each voter to decide if it works for them, if it's something they connect with.
Right, for sure. And it's worth pointing out, I think, that these days, image and messaging, they really matter, maybe more than ever.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the media landscape is so fragmented these days, right? And people are just bombarded with information from all sides. So if you're a politician, especially if you're running for president, you've got to figure out how to cut through all that noise and connect with people on an emotional level.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today, haven't we? We've gone deep on Kamala Harris's journey, her policies, the challenges she faces, what a presidency under her leadership might look like, even her leadership style. I feel like we've really unpack the complexities of her as a political figure.
I agree. It's been a really interesting deep dive. And I hope our listeners, I hope they feel more informed, more engaged, like they're better equipped to make their own decisions about who they want to lead the country.
Yeah, me too. So if you had to sum it all up, what would you say is the big takeaway here? What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember about Kamala Harris as they head into this election?
I think the main thing is that she's a really complex person, She's not easily categorized. She's a trailblazer. She's broken down barriers. But she's also, a pragmatist, someone who's willing to compromise to get things done. She's passionate about social justice. But she's also, a seasoned politician, someone who understands how the game is played, how to make things happen in the real world. So I guess, ultimately what her legacy will be, it depends on how she handles those challenges, those opportunities that are in front of her, if she gets the chance, of course.
That's a great way to put it. And as we head into this election, I think it's so important for all of us to have these kinds of conversations, to really engage with the issues, to think critically about the candidates and what they stand for.
Yeah, absolutely. We got to get past those, those sound bites and the superficial stuff. We got to dig deeper, really grapple with the substance of what's at stake. What kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of future do we want to build? Those are the questions we should all be asking ourselves.
You got it.
Yeah.
So to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly,
go vote.
Yes, go vote. Make your voice heard. It's your future. Make it count.